We welcome you to this event that is co-sponsored by the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies and the Washington Irving Professorship for Spanish and American Relations. It is a special privilege for us to be able to welcome President Jose Maria Aznar and for me to be able to give you a brief introduction. President Aznar was born in Madrid in 1953. He graduated in law from Madrid's Universidad Complutense in the mid-1970s, and shortly thereafter, he began his political career. He was elected head of the regional government of Castilla-León between 1987 and 1989. He was chosen as the center-right Partido Popular's candidate for president in the general elections of 1989, and the following year was elected chairman of the Partido Popular. He became president of Spain in 1996, following the electoral victory of, again, the Partido Popular, and with the party's subsequent election victory in the year 2000, this time with an absolute majority in the parliament. He led the country again until the elections of 2004, when he voluntarily chose not to run for office again. Throughout his 2 terms as Prime Minister of the government, he energetically pursued economic and social reforms. He is the founder and executive president of FAES, la Fundación para el Análisis y los Estudios Sociales. One of the objectives of his visit to Brigham Young University is to explore possible intellectual collaborations between scholars at BYU and students at BYU and the staff at the foundation. One of Mr. Aznar's most serious concerns is the battle against terrorism. He is a strong supporter of the Atlantic relationship and the European Union's commitment to freedoms and economic reform. He has written several books and been awarded 9 honorary doctoral degrees. He was a distinguished scholar at Georgetown University from 2004 until 2011 and was distinguished fellow at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University from 2011 into 2015. He is married to Ana Botella. Some of you who follow Spanish affairs may recognize that name as someone who also has had a distinguished civic and political career. She was the mayor of Madrid up until 2015. They have 3 children and 8 nietos and 8 grandchildren. So please join with me in welcoming President Jose Maria Aznar to BYU.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, dear John, for your kind introduction. Thank you very much, all professors, students that gathering this morning in this center. I am very pleased to be here in Utah. Very pleased to be here in Provo. Very pleased to be here in the university, Brigham University, and especially pleased to be with all of you. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much for inviting me to Brigham Young University. I will address about Europe at a crossroads. There are a lot of things, so I will try to summarize. And let me start for the obvious. This 2019 year holds the most important challenges of the European Union. Aging the concerns about terrorism, the handling of the refugee crisis and immigration. There is the delicate management of the UK's departure, and above all, the European Parliament election, which is the most important election we have had so far. The EU is at a crossroads because it can no longer be said that it suffered a crisis of growth, but a risk of destruction. For many years, we took the European project for granted. We convinced ourselves that the successful integration of European nations could not be reversed because, in fact, it was the responsible of our development and major achievements. And it was. But we dismiss the dormant enemies of globalization, both outside Europe and in the core of our nations. Now, the enemies of the liberal order are stronger than in the past because they are joining their efforts against us. Maybe not all the populist movements are the same, and maybe there are some differences between nationalists and separatists in different countries. Maybe the detailed agenda of the extreme right in the north of Europe is not 100% equal to the one of the extreme left in the south. But for sure, they all agree in the basics. They agree in their hate against the European Union because it is the most successful integration process and the best example of what liberal democracy, social economy, free trade, and globalization can achieve if they are effectively supported by political reforms. So, one of the biggest threats for Europe is her internal vulnerabilities, mainly populism. We can come over the recession, but the social footprint that the crisis has left continues to produce effects in Europe. The credibility of democratic and representative process and institutions of European societies has eroded, as well as their ability to generate prosperity and create opportunities. Populist parties has capitalized the political and electoral effects of it. Let me say that for me, Brexit is a great example of what may happen to Europe if populism succeeds. Brexit is and will be a serious mistake, both from the United Kingdom and for the rest of Europe. Since its very beginning, Brexit is bringing negative effects in various areas. It has weakened the British and European economies and the transatlantic relation. It is making political cooperation more difficult, precisely when new threats such as global terrorism, uncontrolled immigration, or political radicalism are on the rise. After the Brexit, neither the UK or us will be better protected against the new threats than in the past. Being divided weakens us all. Brexit has shaken the continent's geopolitical order. But my main argument to consider Brexit a huge mistake doesn't deal with pragmatism, but with something deeper. Our shared values. The values that shape Europe and the West. Democracy, freedom, and human rights are not mere elements of our social order. These values are substantial to the dignity of every human being in every single country of the Western world. And they are in the core of the most developed nations of the world and are co-responsible of what humanity has achieved. As well, financial instability haunts the European Union, whether member states belong to the Eurozone or not. Having overcome more or less the financial crisis in Greece, Spain, Ireland, and Portugal, the European Union is now facing financial and political uncertainty in Italy, one of the founding members of the EU. In Rome, the Eurosceptic anti-immigrant Northern League party, led by Matteo Salvini, who is also Interior Minister, has jumped in the opinion polls from the 17% it won in parliamentary election last March 2018 to over 30% in December 2018. Support for the EU is plummeting as Italians blame Brussels for their economic problems, not the case of poor economic governance by Rome. Salvini, who is de facto Italy's leading politician, wants to increase spending, which will put even more pressure on the country's large budget deficit and break Eurozone fiscal rules. So far, the European Commission and Rome had avoided a major confrontation after a compromise was agreed. That deal might be temporary. The point is that if market sentiment and investor confidence in Italy were to completely collapse, there will be a new and bigger assault on the credibility of the euro. In France, if the National Front of Marine Le Pen wins, France will leave the euro and the European Union. It will be the end of the European Union, already threatened today by Brexit. In Germany, it is hard to imagine a scenario in which such populist and Eurosceptical force as AfD, Alternative for Germany, could take the reins of power. But although this question is not trivial, the great incognito and the key question for the European Union regarding Germany, given the crisis of Angela Merkel's leadership, is how Germany could accommodate itself in the new European scenario. Germany, as the great economic power of the Union, which has always been, has to assume its condition that is a political power too, whether he likes it or no. German Chancellor Angela Merkel's decisions to step down as leader of the Christian Democratic Union Party in December 2018, and to not run for re-election in 21, will have repercussions for Germany, Europe, and the transatlantic relationship. Merkel's leadership has been marked by her commitments to decency, multilateralism, and diplomacy. Merkel will still hold sway after December, but her authority will no doubt diminish. In March 2017, Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission, launched a white paper on the future of Europe after Brexit. To this end, Juncker paper outlines 5 main scenarios for how the EU could evolve with a view to shaping debate and finalizing a vision for the future that can potentially see the continent emerge from the current political and economic storm engulfing it. The scenarios range for the European Union retreating to no more than the current economic single market, which seeks to guarantee freedom of movement of goods, capital, services, and people. On the other end, on the spectrum, however, is quite different future, where the remaining 27 member states decide to do much more together, reigniting European integration. In view of this situation, I have proposed no less or more Europe, but a possible Europe. We can complete, if we must to complete, the banking union, promote free trade, reform and have a common energy policy. But the European Union, without its transatlantic component, is not conceivable. So, I do not want to end this speech without mentioning those that unite us, the transatlantic relationship and its historical importance. The establishment of an alliance between the democracies of North America and Europe was one of the most important developments of the second half of the 20th century. The Atlantic Alliance is thus one major reason why the second half of the century was so much better than the first. The Transatlantic Alliance, the US and Europe cooperation, became the core of what has been known in common parlance as the West. Such cooperation facilitated the rebuilding of war-torn Europe, created the multilateral infrastructure for unprecedented global prosperity, and the military infrastructure through NATO that deterred the USSR. The embodiment of the US-European cooperation was a process of foundation several global and regional institutions, from the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now called the World Bank, to the OECD, Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, NATO, NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, among others. All these institutions have become a principal support of the liberal world order for 2 main reasons. For their capacity to develop globalized cooperation in the context of the nature of the task states face. No nation can resolve by itself with the traditional tools of statecraft challenges as foods of capital and people, currency crisis, multinational trade disputes, exhaustion of the global commodities, international crime, and other questions. Not to say about the weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, or natural disasters. Another reason of the extraordinary importance of the global institution created by the Transatlantic Alliance is their aptitude to legalize and legitimize the liberal world order. And let me say one thing. It is totally true that Europe is a miracle of the evolution. We went from killing each other by dozens of millions to rejecting the use of force almost under any circumstances. we were able to benefit from the longest period of peace in the continent and account for a culture of endless prosperity. We created the European Union for a coal and steel common market, and many amongst us gave away our currency because we believe in the euro. Unfortunately, our material achievements have not been matched by an increased responsibility to manage the world. Actually, under the present circumstances, it is even less likely that European nations will accept to play a major role in the international arena. And that is why American leadership is as vitally important today as it was decades ago, when the post-World War order was established. If the US were exhausted from fighting too long in too many places, if the US were tired of fighting irregular wars or irregular enemies, where victory is an elusive concept to the matrix of winning. If the US were moving to an increasingly less engaged or exposed posture in the world, rediscovering containment and strategic isolationism, then it would be understandable. But it would be a mistake. Nobody yet is able to take over America's place, and probably nobody will in a long time. Those who defend the virtues of a multipolar world, where the US is just another regular country, will soon find themselves in a non-polar universe, spinning out of control. President Trump has expressed indifference to Europe and NATO. US complaints about European NATO member states relying too heavily on US defense support are not new, but never before have they featured so prominently. If this kind of Trumpist prevails, both America and Europe will lose, and Russia will win. Vladimir Putin is a strategic opportunist, not an imperialist a la Joseph Stalin, but a deal that ratifies Putin's European conquests will sharpen, not satiate, his ambitions. With the US in withdrawal mode, as seemingly Trump to foreshadow, Russian expansion spells low risk and an ample gain. Pushed to its logical limits, Trumpism will make a Stalin dream come true, deliver a Europe denuded of American power and forced to seek accommodation with Moscow. America's lasting investment in Europe's security has come with fabulous profits. Together, the US and the EU add up to the world's largest trade and investment relationship. So, even free trade will be a boon for both. Is NATO obsolete, as Trump has suggested? As every US president since Harry Truman understood, Europe's eastern borders are America's first line of defense. The indispensable nation should not turn its back on these simple facts of economic or strategic life. Thank you very much for your attention.
We have a number of minutes, about 20 minutes, that I think we can use for you to be able to ask questions to President Aznar. A microphone has been provided here to your right. So if you would like to make a question, we would invite you to come down to the microphone, and that way everyone will be able to hear your question.
You like now we can speak English or Spanish? We can practice Spanish.
President Aznar, in May of last year, Angela Merkel said that Europe needs to take its fate into its own hands, that they can no longer rely on the United States. How do you see Europe doing that in the coming years?
It's an expression of the problems, the transatlantic problems. Looking historically, NATO was before than the European Union. What that means? Without NATO, there is non-existent European Union. Second, the problem is that this agreement, this pact, was a pact, seriously pact, between powers under the hegemony of the US. More or less the agreement, the pact was more or less this. We, Europeans, we recognize the hegemony, the world hegemony from the US. We recognize the military predominance of the US. But, on the other hand, the US recognize our capabilities to establish economic development without establishing limits due to the special interests of the US. And to forge this kind of consensus, that is a historical agreement that they forged the West, trying not only to deal the threats of USSR, trying to say Germany, okay, Germans, finish, and your condition of troublemakers is finished. And third, we organize the institutional system of the new world. That's working well, and the great success of the European Union is one of the parts of the history. Another part of the history is the victory in the Cold War. The problem is that some institutional system of the Cold War and after the Second World War are in very serious crisis. If not had been establish a mechanism to substitute this. And now, you can imagine, if we discuss with the US, European powers, we discuss with the US that we must to pay more to the budget of NATO because we not pay enough. Trying to explain that it's necessary to organize a European defense, it is absurd, in my view. You're trying to organize a European defense because we cannot trust in the US? Excuse me. And you can trust in ourselves? You can organize a European defense to fighting the threats of Mr. Putin? Really? To deal with China? Even with President Macron say with confront, if necessary, the U.S. There is no serious. There is no serious. If our pillar, one of the pillars of our guarantees on prosperity and freedom is the relations with the U.S., and for the U.S. as well to be and continue to be the most predominant country in the world, we must to working a lot in trying to reestablish all these breaches in the transatlantic relation. It is very important.
Thank you.
I first of all want to thank you so much for being here, President Aznar. Having achieved a great level of success in your life in the field of government and public policy, what advice would you have for us as young students and who might be interested in achieving success in government and public policy? What advice would you have for us?
Do you have time to read my history?
I did a quick skim of the Wikipedia article.
You have the answer.
Okay.
This is the history of success. No more lessons. No necessarily more lessons. No. All in my life, I always feel a very strong political sentiment. No? I always believe to spend my one part, the most important part of my life, in politics. And my political career was very fast because with 29 years old, almost more or less as today, with 29 years old, I was member of the parliament in Spain for the first time. When 34 years old, I was president of a region, the equivalent a governor. With 34 years old, I was governor. With 37, I was leader of my party and leader of the opposition in Spain. And was 42, I was president of government. And with 50, I said bye-bye. Because I must spend time in other things. I would like to very much to have the opportunity to visit Utah and to have con the students in the American University. But it's a question of success. It depends on a lot of circumstances, but it's a question of mind, clear mind, strong will, never accept a defeat, never, and to be focused always in very important goals. If you are capable to concentrate it in all these questions, your life will be a very great success. But today, the world needed young leaders with convictions, with principles, and with capacities.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Presidente Aznar, gracias por venir a nuestra
En
universidad.
español soy capaz de responder.
Sí,
Sí, sí.
gracias. Recientemente hubo un conjunto en, ¿cómo se llama? En Suiza, Davos, Suiza, sobre el esfuerzo contra el cambio climático. Y mi pregunta es, ¿qué piensa usted serían las consecuencias de un Green New Deal, un nuevo acuerdo para el medio ambiente al bienestar económico en los países ricos, tan como los países en tiempos de desarrollo?
Hoy, entre las cosas que forman parte de la tiranía de lo políticamente correcto, una de ellas es el cambio climático, ¿no? Si tú expresas cierto escepticismo o alguna duda en torno al cambio climático, inmediatamente eres crucificado. Por lo tanto, mucho cuidado con la respuesta. Digo, en los años 60 del siglo pasado, tú no habías nacido, pero yo sí, había un club muy importante que se llamaba el Club de Roma. El Club de Roma era un poquito como Davos ahora, pero era el Club de Roma. El Club de Roma sentenció que el mundo no podía sobrevivir a más de 2.000 millones de personas de población, porque no era capaz de alimentar a 2.000 millones de personas. Y que entonces sentenció que había que ir a un crecimiento cero, impedir el crecimiento y por lo tanto impedir que la población se disparara. Bueno, el fracaso histórico del Club de Roma no hace falta explicarlo, es un fracaso histórico, pero aquello era lo políticamente correcto de entonces, ¿no? Si tú defendías políticas, por ejemplo, en favor de la demografía, o decías que el mundo podía tener 4.000 millones de personas porque la tecnología iba a ayudar a tenerlos, no voy a decir ya 9.000, que ni nos imaginábamos entonces, ¿no? 7.000. Entonces, yo creo que estos acuerdos internacionales hay que entenderlos bien y solamente funcionan cuando los grandes países están dispuestos a respetarlo. El acuerdo sobre el cambio climático está medio muerto, el acuerdo de París sobre el cambio climático, desde que los Estados Unidos decidieron dejarlo. Es muy complicado que poner en marcha políticas de cambio climático sin los Estados Unidos. Sin los Estados Unidos y también sin China, que es el país que más contamina, y también sin otros países. Segundo, reconociendo que todos se pueden producir muchos fenómenos en el mundo. Es necesario tener en cuenta que no se puede utilizar esto para cercenar el crecimiento de los más pobres. Claro, ustedes los ricos se reúnen y llegan a una conclusión que dicen, ahora vamos a tener todo energías renovables, energías limpias, vamos a no tener energías no contaminantes, y ustedes, los países que no están desarrollados, tienen también que cerrar sus carbones, que cerrar sus cosas. Claro, oiga, ¿por qué usted, que es tan rico, ahora decide que hay otros que no se pueden desarrollar? Te digo esto porque con todas las teorías sobre el cambio climático hay que darse cuenta de las consecuencias que tiene todo eso y hacerlo posible para las personas. Yo antes he hablado de no de menos Europa o de más Europa, que son los tópicos de siempre, sino de la Europa posible. Y en términos energéticos tiene que hablar de lo que es posible. Claro, si tú dices, ¿es posible tener, por ejemplo, en mi país, toda la energía en renovables? Es posible, pero el país desaparece. Porque no se puede pagar, ni se puede mantener. ¿Es posible una combinación mejor de energía? Sí, es posible. ¿Es posible hacer otras muchas cosas que mejoren la situación en el mundo? Sí, es muy posible. Es muy posible hacerlo. Es muy posible y muy bueno sería no manchar los mares como se manchan, o evitar los plásticos con todas sus consecuencias, o que nuestros ríos estén limpios, o que todos los elementos que forman parte de esos aspectos de nuestra vida sean una realidad, que haya depuradoras de las aguas residuales, todo eso que contamina tanto, eso hay que hacerlo. Bueno, quiero decir, eso es mucho más complicado, pero no vive ese acuerdo ni va a vivir en los tiempos venideros su mejor momento.
Gracias.
Bueno, presidente Aznar, es un gusto estar aquí con usted. Me llamo Mark y, bueno...
Pues el gusto es mío, Marc.
Muchas gracias. Y, bueno, tengo una pregunta en cuanto a su país, España. Estaba viendo algunas cosas ahí y vi que Cataluña quiere quiere separarse un poco o ser su propio lugar ahí en España. Y solo quiero preguntar por qué quieren hacer eso y qué es su opinión en cuanto a eso.
Yo estoy totalmente en contra. O sea, la nación española es la nación más antigua de Europa. España es la nación históricamente más antigua de Europa. Más antiguo que Francia, más antiguo que el Reino Unido, más antiguo que Italia, más antiguo que Alemania. La primera gran nación europea en existir es España. Y siempre ha existido. Y siempre ha tenido alguno de esos problemas. Pero que haya un grupo de poco inteligentes políticos catalanes, nacionalistas catalanes, secesionistas, que quieran separar Cataluña de España, no lo van a conseguir. El problema que tenemos no es que haya secesionistas, el problema que tenemos es que tenemos un gobierno nacional muy débil, ¿no? Condicionado por los secesionistas, ¿no? Mi posición es totalmente contraria, como sería la tuya. Y en Estados Unidos, explicar esto, tú eres de aquí,
¿Cómo?
¿Tú de dónde eres?
Yo soy del estado de Washington.
De Washington. Muy bien. Del estado de Washington.
El estado, sí, Seattle.
En Seattle. Bueno, pero al lado del distrito del DC estaba Virginia, ¿no? Está
Sí.
Virginia,
Sí, por ahí.
por ahí. Y Virginia fue la capital de Richmond fue la capital de los secesionistas, ¿no?
Sí.
De los sureños, ¿no?
Sí.
Okay. Si tú hubieses tenido la oportunidad de aconsejar al presidente Lincoln cuando él tuvo que combatir la secesión, ¿qué le hubieses aconsejado? ¿Que dialogara? ¿Que aceptase la secesión? ¿Que aceptase que una parte de los estados norteamericanos podían romper la Unión unilateralmente? ¿Que los Estados Unidos dejasen de existir? ¿Que una parte de los Estados Unidos decidiera por todos los Estados Unidos? Yo nunca hubiera aceptado eso. Y yo creo que Lincoln hizo lo correcto, pagó un precio por ello, pero hizo lo correcto. Ahora los precios no son los mismos, pero te quiero decir que las historias no son solamente de un país, pueden ser de muchos países, pero lo importante de los liderazgos, lo importante de la visión histórica, es que tú no puedes aceptar que lo que está unido por lazos históricos, de afecto, de sangre, de todo tipo, pueda ser desgarrado por una banda de gente poco inteligente, ¿no? Ahora, como decía un gran pensador conservador, Edmund Burke, decía que lo único que tienen que hacer los hombres buenos para que ganen los hombres malos es no hacer nada. Si los hombres buenos no hacen nada, ganarán los hombres malos. Y esa es la política que hay que evitar, ¿no? Y la evitaremos.
Gracias.
Gracias a ti.
Last question.
Buenos días, presidente. Muchas gracias por venir. Mi nombre es Elías Bobadilla. Solo tenía una preguntita en cuanto a lo que hemos estado hablando.
Tú eres de abajo, ¿verdad?
Mi familia es de Perú.
Peruano.
Sí. Entonces, usted ha
Pero
mencionado...
lo de la preguntita ya delatado.
Sí. Entonces, hemos hablado de muchos desafíos que estamos teniendo actualmente en el mundo. Como nosotros estudiantes estamos aquí dedicando todo este tiempo a estudiar y recibir esa educación, ¿qué quisiera ver usted en nuestra generación para estar preparado para el futuro? ¿Qué podemos hacer desde este momento para realmente solucionar los desafíos que estamos teniendo hoy en día?
Yo tengo unos valores que defiendo que me han ido bien en la vida, que les he inculcado a mis hijos, a los cuales les va bastante bien en la vida, y que les estoy inculcando a mis nietos, a los cuales espero que les vaya también bien en la vida, ¿no? Pero vamos, yo no creo en la superficialidad que vivimos en la sociedad de hoy, ¿no? Es más, si me permites la expresión, detesto la superficialidad. Y detesto la superficialidad en la política, ¿no? Especialmente. Detesto los políticos superficiales. Detesto los políticos sin ideas. Detesto la aspiración de llegar a un gobierno simplemente para estar, no para intentar mejorar las cosas, no para... Detesto que la gente llegue sin un proyecto y sin ideas a los gobiernos, porque de ahí luego salen todos los males de la corrupción y de los fenómenos negativos para los países, ¿no? Entonces, lo que es muy importante es que hoy, en el mundo de hoy, que es una invitación permanente a todo eso, que es una invitación permanente a la superficialidad, nos demos cuenta que necesitamos. ¿Y en dónde? Te voy a decir una cosa, ¿en dónde? En todas partes. El nivel de la gente que está dispuesta a dedicarse a la política ha decaído de una manera dramática. Y ese es un problema enorme, porque los países tienen que intentar poner su país en las mejores manos posibles, no en las peores manos posibles. Bueno, pues todo lo que sea dedicarse y tener tiempo a tener ideas, a tener convicciones, dedicar tiempo a la reflexión, dedicar tiempo a pensar, dedicar tiempo a la lectura, dedicar tiempo a intentar entender las cosas, a intentar entender los problemas, es mucho más importante que mandar 500 mensajitos por Twitter que no dicen nada. Mucho más importante. Te voy a poner un ejemplo, dice, hay muchos ejemplos, pero te voy a poner un ejemplo. Dice, había un ministro de Asuntos Exteriores soviético, durante muchos años hubo un ministro de Asuntos Exteriores, se llamaba Andrei Gromyko. Andrei Gromyko tenía su despacho en el Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores y el Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores de Moscú era como todos los edificios comunistas, interminable, ¿no? Entrabas en el despacho de Gromyko el lunes por la mañana y te llegabas a su mesa de despacho el miércoles por la tarde, ¿no? De grande que era el... Bueno, pero Gromyko tenía, además de eso, un cuartito al lado. Y en el cuartito tenía una silla y un mapa. Y entonces le preguntaban, y él decía, yo paso aquí la mayor parte del tiempo. Y dice, ¿por qué? Porque así entiendo las cosas. Te doy un ejemplo, no se puede entender muchos de los problemas del mundo si uno los quiere entender y no tiene un mapa delante. Pero no los puede entender tampoco si no conoce cierta historia que condicionan las cosas que están pasando hoy. Y eso es mucho más que un Twitter o que un concurso, es mucho más que eso. Entonces, el dedicar tiempo a eso es una necesidad muy importante en las sociedades de hoy, ¿no? Yo muchas veces explico, perdona y termino, el mundo de hoy es un poquito más complicado todavía, ¿no? Porque si aquí estuviese un mapa del mundo, veríamos y entenderíamos muchas cosas, ¿no? Por ejemplo, ¿por qué los chinos quieren que los norteamericanos se vayan de Asia? O los norcoreanos. ¿Y por qué los japoneses no quieren los australianos tampoco? Bueno, entenderíamos muchas cosas de Europa, entenderíamos muchas cosas de Rusia. Pero en ese mapa la diferencia del mundo de hoy es que hay cosas que no ves. Y todo lo que es la revolución digital en el mundo de hoy, todo lo que son las grandes empresas inmensas en el mundo de hoy, todo lo que es el Alphabet, el Google, el Microsoft, el Amazon, el Netflix, todas esas cosas no se ven en el mapa. Pero son mucho más poderosas y mucho más influyentes que muchas de las cosas que hay en el mapa. Por lo tanto, no solamente ahora tenemos que hacer un esfuerzo de entender lo que pasa, y eso la historia es muy importante, sino también, evidentemente, de procurar entender el mundo de hoy. Y entender el mundo de hoy, en medio de esta revolución fantástica, es una muy buena oportunidad para alumnos tan inteligentes y tan brillantes en una universidad tan buena como es esta. O sea que os animo a ello.
Thank you very much for your attendance.
Muchas gracias a todos, ¿eh? Muchísimas gracias y mucho éxito, que vaya muy bien. Y si necesitáis apoyo, me llamáis, ¿eh? Cualquier cosa me llamáis. Gracias, ¿eh?